Welcome back. Now, Russian President Vladimir Putin has taken part in his first major multilateral meeting since launching his invasion of Ukraine. Speaking at the BRICS summit that Beijing is hosting, he appeared virtually alongside the leaders of China, India, Brazil and South Africa in a show of solidarity with the Kremlin. China's President Xi Jinping slammed the use of international sanctions.
事实一再证明
It has been proved time and again that sanctions are a boomerang and a double-edged sword. To politicize, instrumentalize, and weaponize the global economy, and to willfully impose sanctions by taking advantage of one's dominant status in the international financial and monetary systems will only end up hurting one's own interests, as well as those of others, and inflict suffering on people around the world.
Now, meantime, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is in Turkey. It's the first time he's visited that nation since Jamal Khashoggi was murdered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. And Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is beginning a two-day visit to Iran. He'll meet President Ibrahim Raisi. Now, all of these meetings involve global players with agendas that often don't align with the US and Europe. So let's bring in Ravi Agrawal, the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy, on the significance of all these different alliances that are happening, the conversations that are happening. I want to talk about BRICS. So it's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. It was sort of this alliance that was created in and around the financial crisis. It was emerging market powers coming together. And here they are having this conversation. Xi Jinping is being very clear about sanctions and the collateral damage that it'll do to emerging markets. But interestingly, that a lot of the countries that are having these conversations have not really spoken out against the invasion of Ukraine. What does this tell us about a more polarized world, potentially?
Well, it seems like the world is getting polarized, but I think the BRICS grouping in particular, the ones that are not named China, so the other four, are uncomfortable with a polarization of the world. So in a sense, if you are India or South Africa or Brazil, you're looking at a world in which the US and China seem increasingly at loggerheads. Russia, of course, literally at war with the West. You have all of that, and you have these other three countries, and of course they represent many others in a sense, much of the global south. These are countries that feel that they don't really want to get involved in a global tussle, in another Cold War between great powers. In a sense, what we're seeing is the return of non-alignment, the movement in the 60s and 70s when several countries tried to stay away from great power tussles. Now, obviously, the BRICS grouping, which is led by China in a sense, and this one is being hosted there, they have a vested interest in this. They, even though the world is polarized, they want to see a world in which they get to shape rules and orders, and they get to shape norms. Yeah. They look at the world and they see that America has the Quad Alliance, AUKUS, and it needs an alternative. So that's what's in it for China.
Yeah, and it's important for the viewers to know that this BRICS alliance has been going on for quite some time. In fact, I attended the 5th BRICS summit in South Africa in 2013. There was excitement that emerging market powers were going to hold their own and they were going to build alternatives to Western forces. But at this point in time, it's happening at an interesting juncture where you have Putin saying, you know, we're looking for alternative trade routes. What message would that send to the US or the West as a whole if African countries decide to start doing business with Russia, where China and India are still, you know, engaged economically? Is that going to create that polarized situation that we fear?
I mean, I think the message is very clear to the US and to the West at large. I think they've seen the response to the war in Ukraine over the last 4 months, where on the one hand you have unity among Western nations in sanctioning Russia, in supporting Ukraine, and you have essentially more than half of the world by population saying, nope, we are not going to sanction Russia, and we want to stay out of that. So I think in Washington, conversations I have with lawmakers and diplomats here, there's a very clear understanding that the global landscape is changing. I think part of the issue is this, Eleni, and that's that, you know, during the Cold War, when countries had to pick sides, they knew that their trade with the Soviet Union was fairly limited. This new Cold War between the US and China is completely different. You pick a country anywhere in the global south, and chances are that the US or China are among their top 5 trading partners. So it's much harder if you are in India, a Pakistan, an Indonesia, and Nigeria to say that in this scenario of America issuing sanctions against Russia and China joining Russia or on the same side as Russia, it's much harder for big developing countries to take a side.
So, and we've alluded to all the other conversations that are happening, with Saudi Arabia and Turkey cozying up once again, and we're hearing Turkish officials saying it's the start of a new era and talking about economic and energy deals potentially being signed. And then again, I think about what these new alliances might mean globally, and what message Turkey is sending, because they're blocking, NATO from expanding, for example. And I think there's an undercurrent here that might be playing out.
There is indeed. I mean, these are alliances of convenience. Make no mistake of that. I think, for a country like Turkey, which has had around about 70% inflation this year, its economy is really struggling. Saudi essentially had a blockade of sorts against it. It needs Saudi help. Simultaneously, I think Turkey is very aware that Saudi wants to rehabilitate itself after the Khashoggi killing a few years ago, and so is much more open to new forms of partnerships and alliances, especially in the Middle East. I think Turkey's also aware of the fact that the West needs it. Turkey has been at the forefront of providing drones to Ukraine. Turkey would be at the forefront of easing any blockade in the Black Sea or ensuring that grains are able to get out to the rest of the world. I think Erdogan really understands that he's holding many cards right now. He can use them to his benefit. So it's less about ideology, more about gaining something from the current moment.
And, we also have to mention the fact that Sergei Lavrov going to Iran and listening to sort of the political analysis that's been happening since the start of the war is that countries that have been at the receiving end of sanctions might also be teaming up together to see how they can sort of fight this. Countries that felt ostracized by the US or the West for whatever reason might actually be teaming up together.
Exactly. So you have sanctions on Iran, you have sanctions on Russia. It's only natural that these two countries would look for ways to essentially exchange notes, but also, be able to take advantage of their respective situations, maybe trade with each other, have discussions about, how they're handling issues with their currencies, with being blocked off of Western markets. There's all of that. Is a new sort of global scenario where each country, by and large, is realizing that they are out for themselves. The old way of sort of ideological alliances is much harder to sustain in the current climate with runaway inflation, higher oil prices, and this growing sense that the world order is changing. America and China are increasingly at odds with each other, and the era of American dominance, in a sense, is over.
Yeah, the world order is changing. I think that's something that we're going to be talking about for some time to come. Ravi Agrawal, really good to see you. Thank you so much for that analysis.